Luke chapter 8. Luke chapter 8. On page 624 if you're using one of the Pew Bibles. We're going to read 4 verses, verses 22 down through 25. Now it came to pass on a certain day that he, Jesus, went into a ship with his disciples. And he said unto them, Let us go over to the other side of the lake. And they launched forth. But as they sailed, he fell asleep. And there came down a storm of wind on the lake, and they were filled with water and were in jeopardy. And they came to him and awoke him, saying, Master, Master, we perish. Then he arose, rebuked the wind and raging of the water, and they ceased, and there was a calm. And he said unto them, Where is your faith? And they, being afraid, wondered, saying one to another, What manner of man is this? For he commandeth even the winds and water, and they obey him. And they obey him. One of the calls that annoyed me the most as a 911 dispatcher was missing child calls. Missing child. Somebody calls in, my son or daughter is missing. And one particular instance, there's one lady's 4 or 5-year-old son was missing. I can't remember his name, but he was missing. And that they were at home and he had disappeared. So normally during that time we go through a normal line of questioning. We ask, when did you last see him? We get his name, his age, all these things. When did you last see him? Have you been through your entire house? Have you made sure that he's not in the house? Does he have any friends nearby that maybe he'd just suddenly decide, hey, I want to go play with Johnny across the street, and leave and go play with Johnny across the street? Do you have a pool? Are there any bodies of water nearby? Anything like this? Well, this particular time, the mother decided she didn't want to answer any of those questions, really. And she kept saying over and over, how could you do this to me? How could you do this to me? How could you do this to me? And she would shriek and shrill, screaming his name at the top of her lungs, with also into the phone that I had to my ear. And if there was ever a time that I wanted the ability just to reach through the phone and just slap somebody to get their attention and to break them out of that trance, that was that day. Man, she annoyed me to death that day. Because when your child's missing, that's not the time to be saying, how could you do this to me? Yeah, you want to call their name, not necessarily screeching doing it, but that's a terrible thing to say for one, how could you do this to me? But that's another message for another day. She refused to search the house again. She wouldn't answer a bunch of questions, and so we have a bunch of police officers heading that direction, but she's not answering all these questions, so they're not getting much information. When your child is missing, that's the last time you need to freak out. When your child goes missing, don't freak out. That's the time you buckle down, you get serious, and you say, okay, where could he have gone? And you start checklisting off things, and you start checking, and you start checking, and you start checking. It's not time to freak out and go crazy. You got to stop. In the end, we found him. Guess where he was? Same place they know 95% of the time they are, inside the house playing. All her freaking out did no one no good. And had she listened to me and started doing what I was telling her to do and answering the questions, guess what? We would have found him much sooner because she would have been going and checking the house to find where he's at. See, when you start freaking out in the middle of a storm, in the middle of a problem, you lose focus on what's actually going on. You get focused on the lightning and the thunder and the waves and the wind and everything. You get focused on these things, but you're not focused on the thing that matters. You become very self-focused. And instead of buckling down and becoming serious and paying attention, you see things at a very surface level and what's directly in front of your eyes, and you don't see the bigger picture. You don't see what's actually going on. In the midst of the storm is where we find the disciples this morning. In the midst of the storm. Verse 22 says, Now it came to pass on a certain day. This was after the events that had just taken place, that he went into a ship with his disciples, and he said unto them, Let us go over to the other side of the lake. And they launched forth. But as they sailed, he fell asleep. And there came down a storm of wind on the lake, and they were filled with water and were in jeopardy. And they came to him and awoke him, saying, Master, Master, we perish. Let's pause there for a moment. Now, when it says Jesus and his disciples went into a ship, that's a bit of a misnomer for us, because we think ship, big cruise ship, container ship, something like that. But even the Titanic back in those days would have been massive comparatively. So based on one of the first century boats that they found in the Sea of Galilee, this is more likely what that boat looked like. So not small by any means. I mean, larger than, it's 2 or 3, 4 bass boats or something put together. So pretty big, but not massive by any means. So they're in this boat and they're crossing the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is 13 miles long, top to bottom, and about 8 miles wide at its widest point. It does range in depth, but it goes down to about 141 feet on average. On the northwest shore up here is Capernaum, and then they were going to the land of the Gadarenes, which would be right down in here. You'll see it on the next one, but these are mountains over here, the land of the Gadarenes. So this arrow is about what they were transversing across that part of the sea. So they weren't out in the middle. They were fairly close to land, not terribly far off. Now, regarding the circumstances that they found themselves in, Warren Wiersbe had this to say. Jonah ended up in a storm because of his disobedience. But the disciples got into a storm because of their obedience to the Lord. The disciples simply obeyed Jesus and found themselves in the middle of one of the worst kind of storms that came upon this lake. Now in this one you can kind of see off to the side there the mountainous terrain that is. It's a little bit more sloped than this one tends to show, but it was very, very mountainous on that side of the lake. And the lake itself is about 690 feet below sea level. Those mountains over there are roughly up to 2,500 feet tall. So if you're on the lake looking up at these mountains, they're towering 3,000 something feet above you. So they would be very massive. And anywhere you're at on the lake, you can see the shore. You can see from one side to the other side for the most part on clear days and everything like that. But between May and October, strong winds would come across those mountains from the east, and they would suddenly, as the mountain disappeared, they would dive down into that valley over the lake. And that would cause massive waves to come broiling up. It would push that water and bring in these massive waves. Also, it was warmer down in the valley by the lake, but that wind coming in was cold. And so those temperature clashes would happen, and we'd get massive storms that would just appear like that. Rapid fire storms. We have no idea how many people over the course of history have died on this lake because they were out there, perfectly fine, clear weather, and a storm just, boom, comes up. Many of the disciples, of course, are fishermen, so surely they knew this was their livelihood. This is where they fished. This is their life on this lake. And they would have known all the dangers that the sea harbored, and they would have known that time, we almost died on that lake because this storm came up. And they would have known, so-and-so never came home because this storm popped up on the lake. And here they are, obeying the Master, obeying Jesus, only to find themselves in the middle of these terrible storms. A terrible storm. The boat is filling with water, and if you know anything about boats, generally you don't want water in the boat. That's generally a bad sign. And so it says, water was going in the boat, and they were in jeopardy. They were in dire straits. They were in trouble. This was a problem. And apparently it was so bad that these fishermen, these disciples that grew up on this lake, they knew exactly what it could do. Even they were fearful for their lives in this time. And they found themselves afraid, so afraid that they said, we're going to die. We are dying. We're in the process of dying right now. Later on in Jesus' ministry, we're going to see another account where it's not in Luke, but it's in the other Gospels, where they're in another storm in the middle of the night. And they see a ghost coming to them on the water, which wasn't a ghost, it was Jesus, walking to them on the water. And in the middle of that storm, Peter says, "Lord, bid me come to thee." And Jesus says, "Come." And Peter jumps out and is walking on the water toward Jesus. However, then he started focusing on the winds and the waves and the storm around him. And he got so focused on all those elements that he stopped focusing on the only one that really mattered in that circumstance, Jesus. And so he started to sink. When he kept his eyes on Jesus, it didn't matter what was going on around him. It could have stormed and stormed as much as it wanted to. As long as his eyes were on Jesus and his faith was in the fact that Jesus was walking on the water, so I can walk on the water too, everything was good. But once he started looking at the other things, down he went. And in this story, it's pretty much the same. We see the disciples focused on the storm, focused on the fact that the storm has the power to kill them. It's terrible, but in their focus on the storm, they missed one crucial thing. They went to Jesus and they woke him up. They had to wake Jesus up in the middle of a storm that's going to kill them. As they were going over to Jesus, the alarm bells should have been going off. Wait a second. Why is he sleeping? How is he still sleeping? They're all worried about the storm, but they should have been more concerned about the fact that they couldn't be at peace like Jesus was in the middle of the storm. Jesus entered the same boat, he was on the same journey, going to the same place, sitting in the same seats in the middle of the exact same storm as they were, yet he slept peacefully, undisturbed by the elements around him, while they were fretting over the fact that this storm could kill us. Why did Jesus have peace in the middle of this storm? He had peace in the middle of the storm because he was trusting in his Father. The storm could rage all it wanted to, but he was safe in the Father. He was safe in the haven of rest. The famous painting, Peace in the Midst of the Storm, by Jack Dawson looks like this. A storm, waves of water pouring all over the place. It's hard to see, but in the middle of that storm, there's a bird sitting on her nest, covered, guarded by a little cleft in the rock, undisturbed, unafraid, unworried about the storm around her because she knows where I'm at is safe. Storm can rage and rage, but I'm in the haven of rest. I'm in this little cleft. Storm can't touch me here. Jesus, through his humanity, displayed in that he was sleeping. He was sleeping. He was a human being. Yet even being a human being, he had faith in his Father. His trust and his confidence was very clearly resting in the Father, such that in the middle of this great, terrible storm, he was able to sleep, even though, at least in the disciples' eyes, the whole world was crashing down around them. And this situation should bring certain questions of application to our mind. Are you going to obey the Lord? That's what they did in verse 22. He said, let's go over to the other side, and they cast off. They said, let's go. Maybe better yet, are you going to obey the Lord? They didn't know that the storm was coming. They had no idea. It just came suddenly. But are you going to obey the Lord when you know there's a possibility of a storm coming? A possibility of a storm that will test every ounce of your faith. Maybe this. How are you going to respond when you obey Jesus, but he allows you to be led directly into the storm? What are you going to do in that circumstance? How about this? How much water can your boat hold before your faith runs out? How does your heart respond when you're faced with storms? What do you think when the storm comes up? What do you think? How are you going to do when you're faced with the storms? Do you respond with cries of, Master, Master, I'm perishing? Don't get me wrong. The disciples were right in going to Jesus. He was the one that could save them in this instance. But they didn't need to go wake Jesus up to have faith in Jesus. and see what he could do. They could have had faith in him beforehand and known it was all fine. So do you respond with cries of, Master, Master, I'm perishing? Or can you respond like the Master did? Peace and calm. Now, I'm not saying this peace in the midst of a storm is illogical. It does not ignore the fact that there's very clearly a storm. That's not what peace in the storm means. Peace in the storm means this. It means that even in the middle of the storm, I can rest knowing that anything and everything that could happen to me is inconsequential because I know the master of the storm. He's the friend that sticks closer than a brother. He's the Savior that gave his life to rescue me. He's the God that created the wind and the sea. He created the sea itself. Therefore, I don't need to fear the wind and the seas, but I should fall in reverence before the master of the wind and the seas. And in another note, you don't need the storm to be gone. We often pray, God, remove this storm from my life. But we don't necessarily need the storm to be gone as much as we need the ability to have peace in the middle of the storm. Of course, then the question is asked, well, how can I have peace in the middle of a storm? It's difficult, yes, yet simple. Simple and difficult all at the same time. Isaiah 26, 3 and 4 says this, Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee, because he trusteth in thee. Trust ye in the Lord forever, for in the Lord Jehovah is everlasting strength. The only way you will ever have peace or find peace in the middle of a storm is if you are trusting in Jesus. If you trust in anyone or anything else, or even in yourself, you may have a fake peace, but you won't have real peace in the middle of a storm. If your faith is not anchored in Jehovah, your ability to have peace will rise and fall with how strong the storm appears to be. But when you anchor yourself in Jehovah, you'll have everlasting strength. You'll have the ability to have peace in the middle of a storm. So first, we found the disciples in the midst of the storm. And now, number 2, we see the disciples meet the master of the storm. Verse 24. And they came to him and awoke him, saying, Master, Master, we perish. Then he arose, rebuked the wind and the raging of the water, and they ceased, and there was calm. And he said unto them, Where is your faith? And they, being afraid, wondered, saying one to another, What manner of man is this? For he commandeth even the winds and the water, and they obey him. Matthew's account records for us that before he calmed the storm, after they woke him up, he asked this question, Why are you afraid? Then he calmed the storm. And then he said, Where's your faith? First glance, that question seems foolish. Why are they afraid? Well, duh. Storm, hello. Are you paying attention? But the underlying meaning is they had no cause to be afraid because they're with the master of the seas. They're with the master of the wind, the one who created them. And he was perfectly content to sleep. Though the wind and the sea existed in a fallen world, they were still subject to the master, the one who created them. No storm had the authority to take the life of Jesus. No storm had the authority to deter Jesus from off track. So they had no reason to fear, because as long as they were with Jesus, they were fine. And as soon as they started looking around at the storm and the circumstances around them, that's when they stopped looking at the Master. That's the thing they missed. They stopped paying attention to Jesus, and thus they began to sink. Yet, the good news is this. Even in the middle of their faith in fearlessness, even in the middle of their fear and faithlessness, that's the better way to say that, Jesus exercised a fantastic example of his deity. The fact that he was actually God. Because he stood up Mark records the actual words of Jesus. He got up and he said this, "Peace, be still." Though we often combine them as peace, be still, Jesus actually gave two commands. Peace, be still. First, he said to the wind, he said, "Siopao, be silent, stop speaking." Have you ever stood outside and listened to the wind howling, where it sounds like it has a voice? No doubt that's what they're experiencing. The wind blowing, raging, gets unsettling in your nerves when you hear that sound. And Jesus took the voice of the wind, silenced it immediately. And his second command was to the water, to which he said, "Famao," which literally means to muzzle. Just like you might muzzle an animal to keep him from biting someone, Jesus took the water's bite, if you will, removed it. He muzzled it. He stopped it. See, the wind and the waves have no ears, but they still listen and obey Jesus. They still listen and obey their master. Now, think about this. Think of what it was like for those that did have ears. Think about the guy that hears the storm coming across the lake. And he's standing on his roof in the middle of the night because it woke him up, and he had to put something away that was still outside that he didn't want to get wet. And so he's standing on the roof of his house, hearing the storm, and maybe if it was enough moon, he was seeing the storm coming. And then all of a sudden, he's looking, and he blinks his eyes, and it's gone. And he's wondering, did I just imagine that? Like, did I wake myself up thinking that there was a storm coming and there wasn't one? Yet a couple days later, he hears the rumors. Hey, did you hear what Jesus did the other night? There was a storm and then no storm. Maybe it happened. We don't have to wonder what those in the middle of that storm thought, because they told us. They said one to another, right in front of Jesus. Jesus calms the storm, and standing right in front of Jesus, they say, "Hey, what manner of man is this? This guy right in front of us, what's he like? This guy? Even the winds and water, he commands them and they obey him. What manner of man is this?" 1 Kings 4 tells us that the wisdom of Solomon was greater than that of a wise man that went by the name of Ethan the Ezrahite. You probably never heard of his name. You might have read it, but you never really put it together. Ethan the Ezrahite, 1,000 years before this night, wrote these words. Psalm 89. "For who in the heaven can be compared unto the Lord? Who among the sons of the mighty can be likened unto the Lord? God is greatly to be feared in the assembly of the saints, and to be had in the reverence of all them that are about him. O Lord God of hosts, who is a strong Lord like thee? Or to thy faithfulness round about thee? Thou rulest the raging of the sea, when the waves thereof arise. Thou stillest them." He goes on to say in verse 11, "The heavens are thine, the earth also is thine. As for the world and the fullness thereof, thou hast founded them. The north and the south, thou hast created them. Tabor and Hermon, the mountains, shall rejoice in thy name. Thou hast a mighty arm, strong is thy hand, and high is thy right hand." What manner of man is this? God in flesh, right before their very eyes. The master of the wind, the master of the seas, the master of the entire storm. So I ask this question. Do you know the master of the storm? Like Jesus did to these wind and waves, has Jesus spoken to you? Not to tell you to stop. He told the winds and the waves to stop. Has Jesus spoken to you and asked you to believe in him? Has he spoken to you and told you to have faith in him? If Jesus has never spoken to you, then you're in for a treat, because Jesus is about to speak. He says these words, "I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Believest thou this?" Do you know the master of the storm? Do you? Finally, number 3, we encounter the disciples as they and we learn the message of the storm. The message of the storm. Verse 25, he says these words, "And he said unto them, Where is your faith?" Where is your faith? Now, we could take this account and we can try to make Jesus out to be some kind of bad guy because he subjected the disciples to this test. He allowed this test to come in their lives. They were relatively new believers. At this point in time, it's been roughly a year or so. So, I mean, they're not been a long time, but they've spent a year-ish or so with Jesus. Why would Jesus make this, why would Jesus make them face this test? A test that brings them to the brink of, we're going to die. They were obeying him, and he allowed this storm to come. So why would Jesus place them in the middle of the worst storm they ever faced? And that's this. Because he wanted to test the depth of their faith. He wanted to know how far down are the roots of their faith. Are they like the rocky ground that we looked at last week? The ground that they believe with joy at the beginning, yay, and then it's so rocky, the roots never get down and can't get the moisture. So when the troubles and trials come, they go fluttering away. Are they like that rocky ground? Now, don't get me wrong. You only need a little bit of faith in him. You don't have to have massive amounts of faith, as we looked at back in chapter 7 with the centurion that had great faith. You don't have to have great and massive faith. You only need to have a tiny little bit of faith. His astonishment was at this. Their complete lack of faith. No faith. I mean, if they've only been with him a year, which is a fairly long time, but they've spent an entire year with him. What have they seen him do? He healed somebody without even being present. They walked up to a dead man. They all saw he was dead, and Jesus tells him, get up, and he gets up alive. And they don't think he's got power over a storm? They couldn't even have a little faith that when he said, let's go to the other side, he meant we're going to the other side, and meaning nothing could deter him. There was no force in heaven or hell that could have ever deterred them from the point that they left to the point that they were getting to. Whether it was a storm, whether the boat sank, they were going to the other side one way or another. David Guzik said this, difficult circumstances, storms, tests like we always call them, storms, so to speak, are not evidences of unbelief. When you go through a storm, it's not an evidence that you don't believe. It may show that you don't believe, but it's not an evidence that you don't believe. Storms are going to come and storms are going to go in life. Jesus himself said this in John 16:33. In the world, ye shall have tribulation. There's going to be storms. There's going to be tests. There's going to be problems. They're going to be hard. They're going to be difficult. At times, they're going to feel like your life is going away. Things are going to be harder than you can handle. Storms are going to be worse than you've ever imagined in your life. The statement's often made, God will not give you more than you can handle. I understand what they mean when they say that, but in context, that verse has to do with temptation to sin. When we come to the tests and trials of faith, that's an entirely different ballgame. Routinely, we face storms that are 1,000,000 times worse, 1,000,000 times more than we can handle. I've seen many Christians go through trials. I've seen many Christians go through troubles. Some that I pray I never have to face. And I'm confident if you were to ask those Christians and say, could you handle that storm? They would say no. There's no way I could ever handle that storm. But I'm also confident they'd say this. It was more than I could handle by myself. It was more than we could handle together. But it wasn't too much to handle with him on our side. God's not going to allow a storm to arise in your life that He will not be able to help you handle. That's the key. If we try and go conquer the storms by ourselves, we're going to have trouble. We'll get overwhelmed. But when we go through the storm with Jesus, when we have faith in Him, we can face any storm. No matter the difficulty, no matter the circumstances, no matter the pain and trouble we deal with, no matter if we're strung up to a stake and lit to fire like so many have been, we can go through any trial if He's on our side. Now, why should Jesus being on our side give us faith to march forward in the midst of a storm? The ending of John 16:33 says this. He continued and said, "In the world ye shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I've overcome the world. I've already won. I've already beat it. I've already defeated it." He hadn't even died on the cross at this point, and He was saying, it's as good as done that I've won the whole thing. Because once He was walking on the earth, it was basically done. Because He's already been there, because He's already faced and conquered the storm, this is the announcement He made at the beginning of that verse. "These things have I spoken unto you, that in Me you might have peace." So what's the message of the storm? What did the master of the storm want us to get in the middle of this storm? Simply this: have faith in Him. Trust in Him. The only place you will ever have peace in the middle of a storm is if you are trusting in Him. He's the master of the storm. He's already been there. So trust in Him. So, what storm are you facing? They make the statement, you're either going into a storm, coming out of a storm, or you're in the middle of the storm. So what is it for you? Do you have peace in your storm? Are you going to obey the Lord going into the storm? Are you going to obey the Lord in the middle of the storm? Are you going to praise Him when you use Him and come out at the end of the storm? Do you have faith that no matter what storm is on the way, if He is on my side, 2 thumbs up, I'm ready to go. Bring it on. And finally this, have you met the master of the storm? If you've never met the master of the storm, storms are going to come and they're going to tear you down. They're going to destroy you. But here's the good news. No matter what storm comes, if you've never met the master of the storm, even as you're sinking down, even after the boat has been overrun with water and you're struggling to breathe and maintain, even in the middle of that, you can call on Him. He'll reach out His hand, just like He did with Peter, pull you up out of the water. Mary Baker wrote these words in 1874. She said this: "Master, the tempest is raging. The billows are tossing high. The sky is overshadowed with blackness. No shelter or help is nigh. Carest thou not that we perish? How canst thou lie asleep when each moment is so madly threatening a grave in the angry deep? The winds and the waves shall obey thy will. Peace, be still. Peace, be still. Whether the wrath of the storm-tossed sea or demons or men or whatever it may be, no water can swallow the ship where lies the master of the ocean, the earth and skies. They shall all sweetly obey thy will. Peace, be still. Peace, be still. They shall all sweetly obey thy will. Peace, peace, be still." Do you know the master of the storm? Are you able to have peace in the midst of the storm? What storm are you going into? Let's pray.